Thank you. Well, I thought since today is 2nd of November, it's Day of the Dead, that I would tell you, the word audience, about how you can use my subject of mathematics to make a zombie. So I don't mean a zombie in the kind of Halloween-y Day of the Dead sense, some dead object that is brought alive by some sort of witchcraft. What I want to tell you about is a story about how we might be able to create what we call a philosophical zombie. So what's a philosophical zombie? Well, this is going to the heart of the hard question of consciousness, which is, how can we really tell whether you out there are actually conscious? I mean, some of you are looking a little bit zombified already. But the question of, you know that you're internally that you do have a sense of self. But what about the person next to you? They're doing a very good impression of being conscious. You've engaged with them maybe. But how can we really tell whether there is an internal world going on inside there? We have this idea of homogeneity, which is they're built very much like me, so I suspect there is a self inside there. But I think the real challenge going forward is not so much whether our neighbour is conscious, but whether the smartphone in our pocket might ever become conscious, and how could we tell that? If this thing suddenly starts going, iPhone think, therefore iPhone am, does that mean that it has got an internal world? So this is a story I want to tell you about how my own subject of mathematics may give us some way to tell whether something has an internal world or whether it's a zombie and kind of a big nothing, a big zero. Now, I wanted to start with a little experiment. This is an experiment kind of in similar spirit to Anil's experiments that he did with you. It's kind of giving you an idea of what is the brain doing when it makes you conscious of something. So what I want you to do is to take your program, and I want you to rip out one page in the program. If you're very sort of precious about these things, you can use the whole program itself. But Word make very, very thick programs, which makes it rather hard to do this experiment. Which is what I want you to do is to rip out a page. So great, good, a lot of ripping there, excellent. And I want you to make a little telescope out of your page. Okay, so you roll it up. So you've got a little telescope. And now I'll put an image up on the stage here for you to have a look at. What I want you to do is, first of all, hold out your left hand as if you're saying stop to somebody. Okay, so you want it nice and flat like this. Then I want you to put your telescope between your thumb and your first finger. Now I want you to keep both eyes open. You are going to bring the telescope up to your right eye and keep your left eye open, and I want you to look at the bright stage or this scene of the Alps, and I want you to see this rather strange effect that should be happening, which is that if you look, you've suddenly got a hole in your hand. Are you experiencing that rather weird sensation of keeping both eyes open? As I look at you, I'm seeing you through a hole in my hand. I mean, it's absolutely freaky. When somebody first showed me this, Christoph Koch, a neuroscientist in America, it rather freaked me out. What is happening, of course, is that your brain is receiving information through both eyes. The telescope actually is very interesting, this kind of bright image that's coming down through the hole. But it's your left eye is also receiving the whole of your hand. Your brain is elevating some of this information up into your conscious experience of what you are now aware of. And I think the real challenge is, what is that decision being made by the network to say that now I'm going to say this is important, I'm going to make you aware of this, yet some information you are not aware of. And I think this is a sort of experiments which try to help us to go beyond just saying we'll never know what consciousness is. As a mathematician, one of the things that I always do if I'm trying to understand something is very often to try and understand when something isn't that. So in my kind of journey into the world of consciousness using my mathematical ideas, I've been very interested in looking at things that are not conscious. I mean, for example, Anil mentioned earlier actually the idea of being in anesthesia. That's a moment when you lose consciousness. But I think if you take an egg, a fertilized egg, at what point does a fertilized egg, as it grows in the womb, as it's then born, as it grows, becomes a toddler, a teenager, an adult, there's a very big change in the level of consciousness. At what point in the growth of that thing does the consciousness change? Is there a moment when things kind of switch on, or is it a very gradual change? Well, there does seem to be a moment when something really dramatic changes in the network. If you've got toddlers, try this experiment. If you put a toddler in front of a mirror, and they play with the mirror, they look at themselves, which toddlers know, at what age do they know that that's a picture of themselves? And how would you test that? That sense of self, part of the idea of consciousness. Well, one way to do this is if you put a surreptitious little mark on their forehead, which they can't see unless they see themselves in the mirror, who responds? At what age do you respond and say, that mark is on me? If you take a toddler about 14 to 18 months, they will not react. They might touch the mirror, they might look behind the mirror. But something seems to change in the network of the brain between 18 to 22 months, that when they start to look at this and they see this strange mark on their forehead, you will see their hand immediately go up and say, I've got something on myself. So I'm interested in that transition of the moments when something changes in this network, and can we actually measure perhaps what it is that is changing, which suddenly gives a child a sense of self? We can also ask this, for example, in animals. Do animals have the same level of consciousness as we do? Which animals have the same level? Are there different gradations here that we can measure? Again, it's quite hard to ask an animal about its internal world, but this idea of this mark on the forehead is a very good one. Gordon Gallup, who came up with the idea of this mirror self-recognition test, was using it on animals. So he was interested, what animals react in the same way as a child to the fact that they are in front of a mirror, they get used to the mirror, the person marks the forehead with a little mark. What's the reaction of an animal to seeing themselves in the mirror with this mark on? It's remarkable how few species actually pass this test. This is an orangutan. The orangutan, as this orangutan looks in the mirror, suddenly spots this rather strange yellow mark and puts her hand up to the mark to see what it is. And it turns out only chimpanzees and orangutans will react in this way. As you can see, the orangutan there is actually rather annoyed with the, what is this yellow gunk that's on my forehead? There are a few animals that pass this, a very clever magpie, but not universally as a species. Dolphins, we think, do, although again, it's quite hard to mark a dolphin, but there have been experiments there. Chimpanzees lose this ability about 15 years into their life, and it's thought that maybe consciousness comes at a great expense because it allows you to do time travel. You can look into the future and therefore perceive your own death. And so maybe it's a good idea to lose this ability as time goes on. So this, we see that there are animals and so that have a kind of sense of self in this very crude sense of consciousness. But my most exciting sort of discovery on this journey to see what might be the property of a network which makes it conscious was when I went to a sleep laboratory in Madison, and I talked to a scientist called Giulio Tononi, who has some very interesting ideas about how you might tell whether a network has become conscious. And this is what I want to share with you today because I think it might be very important tools as we go forward to understand the technology that we're creating when it might actually have a sense of self inside. So I went to this sleep laboratory, and what they're doing is that sleep is a time when you become unconscious. Deep stage 4 sleep, when you're not dreaming, is a moment when things switch off. If I was going to define consciousness, I might say it's the thing which, it's very hard to say what that is. It's kind of the thing which you lose in sleep. It's the thing which goes away. So I would define it almost as the thing that you don't have in stage 4 deep sleep. So what Giulio Tononi said is, well, let's ask the brain when it's awake and when it's asleep a question and see whether it responds in different ways. But how do you ask somebody a question when they're asleep? That's very difficult. But now we have ways of sort of turning on neurons in the brain, this thing called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which essentially our brain is like a set of switches, these neurons. I can turn a switch on and see what the logical implications of that neuron switching on are in the brain. And so we can do this certainly when we're awake. So this is the experiment. So we're going to switch on some neurons and see what the effect of this transcranial magnetic stimulation of switching on these neurons in the brain. And you can see when you're awake, what happens is there's this kind of cascade of information. So it's like a set of logic gates. I switch it on, this one switch another neuron on. This cascade goes across the brain, then feeds back to the original source, goes out again. It's a very kind of connected and integrated behavior, this kind of looping back. Anyone who was brought up as I was on Gödel, Escher, Bach, a book actually all about consciousness. Hofstadter already had this idea that what makes us human is the fact that we are kind of things called strange loops, that there's a feedback behavior. And we can see this in the logical implications of switching on this particular neuron. Now let's see what happens when you turn on the same things when you're asleep. Now I'm a very light sleeper, so I failed this bit of the experiment because I knew somebody was going to come and zap me with this magnetic stimulator. So this is actually somebody else's data. But when you're asleep, it's as if the network has gone down. The tide has come up and the connections are somehow severed. There's a lot of local activity, but there's not this kind of integrated behavior across the whole brain with a feedback mechanism. That there seems to be a very different network behavior. Giulio Tononi has tried to capture this idea of the very special nature of a network when it's awake and when it's asleep in a mathematical formula to try and identify the fact that we have one integrated conscious experience. We don't have many, so it seems like the network is highly connected. If you cut it in two, it behaves very differently. So this mathematical formula tries to capture that. So it's actually a coefficient. It's a number from 0 to 1 which measures your level of consciousness. So, what makes you you is actually, Giulio Tononi believes, is this mathematical formula here. And it means that we can actually grade different levels of consciousness because it's from 0 to 1. I think probably you'll end up having a much more multi-dimensional approach to what is consciousness rather than putting it just on a one-dimensional scale. But I think this is a very good first step. It's certainly not the answer to what is consciousness, but I think if you have a network which this actually goes very high in its coefficient, it might mean it has a sense of self. This has allowed people to have the idea of creating a zombie, because here are two networks. The networks, one of the things Turing said is if you interact with somebody and they seem intelligent or they seem conscious, you should just say they are. But maybe there's nothing going on inside. How can you truly tell whether they're conscious? So if you can't get inside their brains, it's by interacting with them. But what if somebody is doing all the things that you expect of a conscious being, yet there is nothing going on inside? Can that be possible? Giulio Tononi believes, yes, it is possible. These are two networks. The network on the left is a network that has a high level of consciousness. The way the neurons are connected and integrated, this measure says that this thing has an internal world. The network on the right behaves in exactly the same way. It has the same input-output behavior. So if you interacted with it, you couldn't tell it was any different from the network on the left. But yet it has only a feed-forward mechanism within the logical connections such that the level of consciousness measured by this formula is actually 0. This is a zombie. This is a network zombie that, when you interact with it, appears to have exactly the same input-output behavior as the one which seems to have an internal world. So I think this is certainly first step towards perhaps being able to tell whether a network becomes conscious. But not only that, it helps us to understand maybe when an audience, I mean, you sort of have a collective sort of consciousness because we're interacting. There's not much integration here between you. It's very one way through this particular node. But what about a city? What about the universe? When did the universe have its first conscious thought? Maybe we are able to kind of measure these things and realize that consciousness isn't just an on-off switch, but is actually part of a whole graded scale. Thank you.